So obviously, we're dealing with the most active wildfire season in Nebraska on record. Up to this point, we've had about 2 million acres burn across the U.S. Almost half of that is in Nebraska alone. So the Great Plains as a whole are dealing with a pretty significant issue here. And this is nothing new. Over the past 4 years, we've had active wildfire seasons start as soon as February, into March. We are seeing a bit of a green up right now with all this moisture. The problem is that we haven't received enough perpetual moisture over the past few months. Once again, we haven't had enough snow packed, and that leads into these very active spring seasons where it's wildfire galore essentially. Something we experienced this past spring with those massive fires out west was this idea of defensible space around a home. As we have this green up, now is a good time to start thinking about strategies to protect your home in case you are in the midst of an active wildfire. So with strategies like FireWise, what we encourage people to do is to look at planting strategically, right? There are different zones around your home, right? Within 0 to 5 feet, we like to see folks plant, as little as possible actually. Try to avoid things that might be flammable in case there is an active fire. As we get from 5 to 30 feet, that's where we start to look at things like, native perennials, shortening your grass as much as possible, and then try to get rid of anything that might act as a fuel during a wildfire situation. So why is that important? It's important because if you are in the midst of a wildfire, we want to give firefighters as much time as possible to respond on the scene and protect your home. We saw that out west with the Morrill and Cottonwood fires, and it's pivotal now more than ever, really.
Especially out west, it's still an extreme drought. Obviously, they got some rain this past week, however, it was not enough in the long term to subside things. And if we start having these windier days again, especially, that's when you really need to start watching out. And over the next few weeks, there are some of those days coming up, and hopefully this rain was enough to get us past those, but you just never know, especially one little spark out there with how dry it's been, and I've heard people saying it's not greened up in some places. One little spark out there and that can just take off on those windy days. So especially looking at our summer outlook when it's going to be hotter and drier is what is expected. Once you start getting into later summer, if these deficits keep growing and stuff really hasn't greened up, that's a major fire hazard, especially, as he said, later in harvest when those combines go through there and it's really windy and stuff's just blowing around, it could take off instantly.